Hello, everyone. I'm going to read to you out loud the article titled Island Civilization, A Vision for Human Occupancy of Earth in the Fourth Millennium by Roderick R. Nash. This is located on page 10 of your reader. Please feel free to follow along as I read. Here's a word of caution. This is a long article, and I am not a perfect reader, so I will likely make mistakes. I will likely mess up, and I'll pause, and I'll say a word wrong. Please ignore that to the best of your abilities. I apologize. Okay. Without further ado, here we go. And I'm going to skip the quotes and whatnot and go right to paragraph 1. The new third millennium we are just entering affords an excellent opportunity to think big about the history and future of wilderness and civilization on planet Earth. Of course, a millennium is an entirely synthetic as opposed to astronomical concept. Measuring time in thousand-year units only began in 1582 when Christian officials arbitrarily fixed a date for the birth of Christ. So there was nothing special about December 31st, 999. It wasn't even recognized as the end of the first millennium. But we made a big deal about the end of the second one 1,000 years later on December 31st, 1999. Here we have an opportunity to transcend our species' characteristic myopia. Rarely do humans make plans more than a couple of years in advance. And we don't do history very well either. It's a safe bet that you can't name 2 of your 8 great-grandparents, right? Similarly, we don't often think in the wider angles that encompass our species as a whole. So my mission here is to review the human-nature relations and to extend our concern to the big picture. What could the human tenure on Earth be like 1,000 years from now, at the start of the 4th millennium? My proposal involves some really major changes and will be controversial. At first glance, you may think island civilization is crazy and impossible, but not so fast, my friends. Don't stop the criticism. The whole purpose of this essay is to put forward for discussion a strategy for occupation of this planet that will work in the very long run and for all the natural world. This is simply the greatest challenge facing our species and, in a sense, facing evolution on Earth. If you disagree with some or all of my vision, create your own, particularly if you think staying the present course is the way to go. Put forward your evidence and reasoning. The essential thing is that we occasionally lift our eyes from everyday details and 5-year plans to the far horizons of planetary possibility. Having such a goal is a vital first step to solving problems. Without it, we lack direction and the means to evaluate options as they come into focus. As a starting point, let's consider wilderness. It's a state of mind, a perception rather than a geographical reality. And prior to the advent of herding and agriculture about 10,000 years before the present, it didn't exist. But after we began to draw mental lines between ourselves and nature and to place walls and fences on land, the idea of controlled versus uncontrolled environments acquired meaning. The root of the word wilderness in Old English was something that had its own will. The adjective that came to be used was wild. For example, wildfire, wild, undammed rivers, wildcats. You can't hurt them. The other important part of the word, ness, indicates a condition or place. So wilderness literally means self-willed land, a place where wild, undomesticated animals roam and where natural processes proceed unencumbered by human interference. After humans created farms and literally bet our survival on them instead of hunting and gathering, uncontrolled nature became the enemy of the new civilization. Pastoral societies like those that produced the Old and New Testaments became obsessed with making the crooked straight and the rough places plain. For thousands of years, the success of wilderness seemed to mandate the destruction of wild places, wild animals, and wild people. In the Bible, wilderness was the land God cursed. Its antipode was called paradise. Adam and Eve lost it when they angered God and found themselves banished into the wild. The first European colonists of the New World carried in their intellectual baggage a full load of bias against wilderness. The last thing settlers of the eastern seaboard had in mind was protecting the wild nature or establishing national parks. Indians were savages who needed to be civilized or eliminated. After a rocky start, these pioneers became very good at breaking the will of uncontrolled land and people. Axes, rifles, and barbed wire, and more recently railroads, dams, and freeways, were the celebrated tools of an environmental transformation that left the wilderness in scattered remnants. Lost in the celebration of westward expansion, however, was the possible irony in the process. When does success in too great of a dose produce failure? We always thought of growth as synonymous with progress, but maybe bigger is not better if it creates a civilization that is unsustainable. Maybe what really needs to be conquered is not wilderness, but rather our technological, capitalist driven culture in its cancer like tendency to self destruct. Americans began to explore these revolutionary ideas as the second millennium drew to a close in the 19th and 20th centuries. As early as 1851, Henry David Thoreau thought that wilderness held the key to preservation of the world. George Perkins Marsh, a well-traveled diplomat who spoke 21 languages, understood in 1864 in his remarkable book Man and Nature that with their improved technology, humans had become a new and destructive force of nature. He suspected that what humans assumed to be victory against the forest primeval could end up defeating their dreams and progress and prosperity. Beginning in the 1870s, John Muir reversed thousands of years of Judeo-Christian attitude by publicizing mountain forests as temples and cathedrals. What shocked Americans of this generation the most was the United States Census pronouncement in 1890. That there was no more frontier. With the Indians crushed, the buffalo almost gone, and the big industrial cities losing their luster, it was possible to think that the cherished civilizing process could go too far. The appearance in the 20th century of best-selling books with a primitivistic, I don't know if I said that right, primitivistic slant like Jack London's Call of the Wild in 1903 and Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan in 1913 indicated that the relative valuations of wilderness and society were changing. As the 20th century began, a scarcity theory of value began to reshape the relative importance of wilderness and civilization in the United States. It explains the national angst over the ending of the frontier. Attitude toward wilderness was not passing over a tipping point from liability to asset. Of course, the pioneers did not go camping for fun. Wilderness appreciation and later preservation began in the cities where the wild country was perceived as a relative novelty and substantially less threatening. The rationale of the early movement for wilderness was almost entirely anthropocentric. Scenery, recreation, and the economics of new nature-based tourism underlay the growing popularity of wild places. More sophisticated but no less utilitarian were ideas of wilderness as a church, a museum of national history, a stimulant to a unique art and literature and psychological aid. These were good arguments for their time, and they underlay the establishment of the first national parks and wilderness. The Wilderness Act of 1964 was revolutionary, but make no mistake, its point was the benefit of people. A new biocentric rationale for wilderness emerged in the last 50 years of the second millennium. At its core was the idea that wilderness had intrinsic value, that its protection was not all about us. Rather, it was a place where our civilization took a badly needed time out from our 10,000-year-old obsession with the control and modification of the planet. In honoring wilderness, we manifested a capacity for restraint. Preserved wilderness was a gesture of planetary modesty, a way to share the spaceship on which all life travels together. The roots of this valuation of wilderness run back in the United States history, to Henry David Thoreau's belief that wilderness is a civilization other than our own. John Muir wrote about the rights of all the rest of creation that civilized humans had consistently ignored. The case for the right of certain animals had even been vigorously made in England and the United States in the 19th century, and in 1915 Albert Schweitzer extended the ideal to reverence for life. The implication here, and in Cornell University botanist Liberty Hyde Bailey's book The Holy Earth, also 1915, was not just being a good manager or steward of nature, but respecting it as an ethical equal because it had been created by God. As Bailey put it, humans should put our dominion into the realm of morals. It is now the realm of trade. This theological holism, which has a long history in Western thought, and even longer in Asian cultures, received major support from the new science of ecology. The phrase food chains first appeared in 1927, and ecosystem in 1935. Focusing on interdependencies, ecologists gave scientific reason to believe that nature was a community to which mankind belonged, not a commodity it possessed. Sorry, my bad. My apologies, I lost my place. Take a break for a minute while I find it. Here we go. Starting paragraph 11. In essays written in the 1920s and 1930s, and particularly in his book A Sand County Almanac in 1949, wildlife ecologist Aldo Leopold became the first major American articulator of what he called the land ethic. It is significant that wilderness preservation was one of Leopold's highest priorities. It constituted, Leopold argued, an act of national contrition on the part of a species notorious for biotic arrogance. In the 1960s, the emergence of Leopold's book as a bestseller, along with the popularity of ecologist Rachel Carson, particularly her Silent Spring in 1962, evidenced a changing American attitude toward nature. Conservation, around as a term since 1907, had been strictly utilitarian in its emphasis on national strength and prosperity. Preservation, which John Muir favored, implied human benefit from controlled and unutilized environments. A new 1960s word, environmentalism, took a broader view of utility, gave rise to the term pollution, which impacts many species, and added momentum to the idea of the rights of nature. Theologians and philosophers joined environmentalists in arguing that the nation's natural rights tradition, which had extended the moral community in the past to include black people, natives, and women, should now turn to the task of liberating another oppressed minority, nature. The phrase deep ecology appeared in 1973 to describe a belief in the right of every life form to function normally in a shared ecosystem. Some philosophers extended their application of rights to landforms like rivers and mountains and to ecosystems. This line of ethical thinking suggested, just as John Locke's social contract mandated restrictions on individual. I'm going to start over on paragraph 12. This line of ethical thinking suggested, just as John Locke's social contract mandated restrictions on individual freedom in the interest of creating a sustainable society, so an ecological contract might restrain the human species in its relations to the ecosystem. The passage of the Marine Mammals Protection Act in 1972 and the Endangered Species Act in 1973 were remarkable in that they endowed non-human species with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in appropriate terms, of course. Significantly, many of the species protected were not considered cute or useful to humans in any way. Their value was intrinsic, and their membership in the biotic community indisputable. The appearance of biocentrism and the environmental ethics were encouraging, but an avalanche of evidence suggested that civilization continued to wreak havoc with natural rhythms and balances, such as the third millennium began. Awareness of the problems has penetrated deeply into contemporary thought and discussion. Accelerated human-caused decline in biodiversity amounts, in the opinion of many biologists, to a sixth great extinction. More humans than existed since the start of the species occupy the planet in 1950, and the population surged upward at 1 billion every 15 years. Sprawling into open space at the rate in the United States alone of 6,000 acres each day, people dominated most of the preferred locales in the temperate latitudes. Climate change now seems to be at least partially human-induced. Freshwater, soil, forest, and food issues make the headlines daily. Lurking just over the horizon are concerns over massive epidemics. They didn't know this was coming. And the dark, cold specter of a nuclear war that would take down most life on the planet. Civilization in a word appears vulnerable. Making the point explicit, Jared Diamond's book Collapse in 2005 underscores the lack of sustainability in many human cultures over the last 10,000 years, and suggests strongly that we are not exempt. There will be a resolution of environmental problems, he argues, if not by intelligent choice, then by ecological disaster and social disintegration. As far as wilderness, where most of the 30-odd million species sharing Earth reside, it is now an endangered geographical species. Only about 2% of the contiguous 48 states are legally wild, and the same amount is paved. I made sure to include the exclamation point there. Much of the American landscape has been modified to some degree. And the United States is a leader in national parks and wilderness preservation and is only a little more than a century beyond its frontier era. In other older regions, France and Japan come to mind, environmental control is near total. At least in the temperate latitudes, we are dealing with remnants of a once wild world, and we face irreversible decisions about their future on a planet that suddenly seems small and vulnerable. In a century, wilderness could disappear or become so fragmented as to be ecologically meaningless. Some now view this not as a violation of the rights of the humans to enjoy wild nature, but the right of other species and self-willed environments themselves. Okay, I'm going to stop it here and I'm going to make another video of the last few paragraphs. So I will post that as well.